Test. Yeah. Oh, that's working fine. Great. You ready?
Whenever you are, we can also go and grab more people out of the room next door.
Well,
We should probably do.
yeah, let's grab the folks.
All right.
Do you think we should tell the people live streaming that we'll be right there, or be right?
We will be.
Okay.
Everybody, this time there's plenty of sandwiches.
Yay!
So if you denied yourself, grab something.
Thank you.
I think you can eat in here too, so,
Yes.
yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. It doesn't bother me unless you smack your lips a lot. But I can't see you anyway, so it doesn't matter.
There we go. Perfect.
I just blame it on John Longwell.
Okay.
Will the slides be visible in both monitors today?
Should be. I don't know.
Oh, I don't think.
No.
Still cold. You and Debbie.
Yes.
All right, welcome everybody to this second week on Primer in Christian Nationalism. I just want to apologize for not being able to be here last week. Evidently, on some travels, I caught a pretty nasty bug, and it was just beginning. That Sunday, I did the first presentation. I don't know if some of you remember, but my voice wasn't quite my voice. My wife calls it my sexy voice, but I don't find the fact that it feels like somebody's dragging sandpaper up my chest as being very sexy. But anyway, I got home and I crashed, and the rest of that week, I slept all day and all night. It's awful, and I'm still fighting, but I'm doing okay now. I'm here, and I've been able to work on this all week and ready to go. So this week is week 2 from Christ, and I titled it From Christ to Christian Nationalism: The Evolving Relationship Between Church and State from the Birth of Christianity to the Present. That's a long time, 2,000 years, folks. I also have a second title, which is really the one that I like better, but It's a little bit more sarcastic. Or the rise, fall, and reemergence of Christendom. So that's what we're doing. I feel like I've been immersed in a course on political theology of the Western world over the past few weeks, as I'm trying to get to the bottom of some of this dynamic between church and state. Today we're going on a journey that will stop at various moments where the relationship between church and state evolved, at least in the West. And we're going to hop from one moment, one event, or one evolution in that relationship to the next. And we're going to have a more extended stay in the American colonial era up until the present. But what I'm trying to do here is take a thread and draw the thread from the time of Jesus and the early church through to where we are today. And what were those significant things that happened that have given shape and form to the relationship between church and state, at least in the West, right up until we are today. Some of the most important events shaping our current moment occurred between Constantine and the Protestant Reformation. So we'll look at that. Last time I proposed that the chief end of Christian nationalism is dominion. The means for getting there is a restoration of modern form of Christendom. So our journey will focus mostly on the emergence of Christendom. In other words, I'm not going to cover everything in church history in the next 40 minutes, obviously. I'm going to focus on those things that had to do with the development of Christendom, how it evolved, and ultimately, really what led to its decline in the modern world. My proposal of restoration, I think, of Christendom will make sense after our tour. But that's the metaphor I want you to think of. We're going to be on a little bit of a tour here, making some stops. In simpler terms, I want to address this question. And it seems simple, and yet it's very, very important. How did we get from Jesus to Christian nationalism in 2025 America? So buckle up. Here we go. The relationship between church and state is among one of the most defining and at times contentious dynamics in the Western world history. This complex interplay has profoundly shaped societies, governance structures, theological doctrines, and frankly, the fate of many. From the roots of Christianity under Roman oppression through the transformational embrace of by Constantine, from the medieval battles over investiture, that gets pretty rare stuff, and into today's debates over religious freedom, pluralism, and Christian nationalism, the questions remain. And they are, who rules? And by what right? What is the proper place of religion in public life? And what lessons do centuries of contest and compromise hold for our present moment? So consider this a journey through 2,000 years of church history, at least in the West. And if I seem to enjoy this a little too much, you need to realize that church history and historical theology were some of my favorite topics in seminary, though you also need to know that that was a very, very long time ago. So there may be a few cobwebs in there somewhere, sorry. All right, let's begin with a brief definition of Christendom, because ultimately that's what all this is going to be about. Christendom refers to the historical idea of a unified Christian civilization in which church and state were closely intertwined. It describes both the cultural community shaped by Christianity across Europe, roughly from the early Middle Ages through to the modern period, and the political religious system in which rulers and clergy shared authority, with the church often claiming supremacy in spiritual and moral matters. In short, Christendom equals the fusion of Christian faith, culture, political order into a single overarching framework for society. Now, with this as our working definition, let's begin our tour. Our first stop is the first century after the birth of Jesus. It's not easy to open our Bible and begin to read the Gospels and Acts and Paul or the other letter writers to the various churches in the Roman Empire, and then suddenly land 3 years later in Milan under Constantine, where he made Christianity legal. That was a big leap over 300 years. The early Christian church, emerging from first century Judea into the heart of the Roman Empire, was fundamentally an outsider community, both socially and politically. To Rome, the Jews were a peculiar people, obstinate to the bone, and very difficult to govern. So much so that we all, I think, know that finally by 70 AD, they said, that's it, and they took it all out. For nearly 3 centuries before Constantine, Christians were generally marginalized, sometimes tolerated, often persecuted, yet always distinct from the power structures of the state. Christ himself famously declared, and is used often by this whole conversation, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God, setting a precedent for the dual spheres of allegiance and conscience that would reverberate through the Christian political thought up to this day, and not without a lot of controversy. Charity and care for the poor were particularly important as the early church distinguished itself by its commitment to the marginalized, often using resources from wealthy converts to care for those in distress, regardless of their faith. And importantly, there was little desire and not much opportunity for Christians to wield political power anyway, or to seek influence over civic affairs. In other words, they just kind of tried to live under the radar and live out their Christian faith by caring for the poor and the marginalized, etc. Now, relationships with the Roman state oscillated between indifference, there's Christians are out there, intermittent persecutions, notably under Nero, Decius, and Diocletian, and periods of peace. But the defining feature was a sharp distinction. The state demanded allegiance and the performance of rituals acknowledging the emperor's divinity, while Christians committed to a monotheistic worship saw such demands as idolatry and refused, sometimes at great personal cost. The state interpreted this refusal as a threat to its stability and unity. Despite the growth and partial social integration of Christianity, with some elites and officials actually becoming Christians and joining the movement, the church-state relationship remained formally and conceptually adversarial. The early Christian ethos was one of loyal but critical distance. I'm going to say that again because it's important. The early Christian ethos was one of loyal but critical distance, obeying laws, praying for rulers, yet refusing to compromise on core doctrines or participate in civil practices that violated their consciences. And so a theology of martyrdom and suffering rather than domination or political influence prevailed. Faithfulness was measured by endurance and witness, not by institutional power. And frankly, this is an aside note here, there is a model here for us as we try to imagine the alternative to Christian nationalism. Maybe not so much the martyrdom part. Loyal, but critical distance. Something to consider, but I digress. Our next stop is Milan, 313 Common Era. Constantine has won the Battle of Milvian Bridge, which he attributes to the Christian God. He supposedly converted to Christianity, though he wasn't baptized until his deathbed, and there are, to say the least, a few other irregularities in his life. But Christianity was made legal under him. In 313, he and his co-emperor Licinius issued the Edict of Milan, which granted Christians, and all religions at that point, the freedom to worship without persecution, though in practice, and this is important, it marked the beginning of an imperial preference for Christianity. This was one of the most dramatic and consequential reversals in world history. And if you go to seminary, we always talk about this moment, and usually, at least in conversations I was in, how terrible it was for the church when it happened. But again, I digress. This occurrence rapidly accelerated Christianity's transformation from outsider movement to favored institution. Constantine rapidly became deeply involved in church affairs. Not as a theologian, he left that to the bishops, but as an emperor seeking unity in his empire. He provided funding for churches, granted privileges to clergy, and intervened in disputes when they threatened political stabilities. And if you study that era, there were all kinds of heretical movements going on that ultimately came together in the Council of Nicaea, where the Nicene Creed was formalized. But that's not relevant to what we're talking about. He was the emperor, as I said, seeking unity. He provided all these things that he saw would help the stability, the social stability of the empire. In that sense, he became deeply involved in the administration of the church. One highlight is his calling of the Council of Nicaea to deal with the Arian controversy about Christ's divinity. The emperor was now intricately involved in the church's doctrinal disputes. Now think about that. In that 300-year period, they went from being persecuted outsiders to intricately involved in the empire itself with the emperor. In 380 Common Era, a few years later, under Emperor Theodosius I, who was the last to govern both western and eastern halves of the Roman Empire, Nicene Christianity, that is Christianity coming out of the Nicene Creed and what the Nicene Creed says, this is what true Orthodox Christianity is, became the official religion of the empire. Now that's another step. Constantine legalized it, but he legalized all religions. This step was another step in which Christianity was formally declared the official religion of the empire, and the machinery of state would increasingly be marshaled in its support, even against competing Christian sects or non-Christian religions. And my friends, that moment was the birth of Christendom. The fusion of church and state was formally established. The long-term trajectory of the evolving Christendom was toward a system in which political and ecclesiastical authorities worked in complex and sometimes tense partnership in order to order society around Christian ideals. In some eyes, this was a great triumph. In others, it was the beginning of a tragic fall from the apostolic purity of witness. What follows is how this new relationship evolved. Some of the ideas were brilliant. Some set terrible precedents that we struggle with to this day. Our next stop is 30 years plus in North Africa. The Vandals had sacked the city of Rome in 410. The ensuing crisis prompted the North African bishop Augustine of Hippo to write the famous The City of God. This massive treatise is perhaps the most influential Christian meditation on church, state, history, eschatology, and Western tradition. It continues to influence us to this very day. Kirk makes reference to Augustine at times. Augustine wrestled with the question, how are Christians to live faithfully in a fallen world while belonging ultimately to God's kingdom? That's a pretty serious thing to wrestle with. I confess that I've wrestled with this very question my entire Christian life, which at this point has been quite a while. But starting at the age 18 when I became a Christian, all the way up to now. In his book, Augustine distinguished between the city of God, composed of those whose ultimate allegiance is to God and eternal realities, and the earthly city, marked by love of self, temporal anxieties, and worldly ambition. These two cities are interwoven, they're intermixed during history, but have fundamentally different ends. And I think if you think about it in your own life, if you've been a Christian for a while, you appreciate the tension that presents to us a lot. For Augustine, earthly polities, even Christian ones, cannot be equated with the kingdom of God and are always open to corruption by pride, violence, and sin. And this is an important point that speaks to the issues I have with Christian nationalism today. How much does one's theology begin to merge the two cities, even if you're unaware of doing so? Augustine did not teach Christians to retreat from public life or to separate religion completely from society and politics. Rather, he sees civil authority as legitimate and even ordained by God for the preservation of order, justice, and peace. Christians are called to participate in public life, upholding justice, seeking the welfare of their cities, and working for the common good, while holding ultimate loyalty to God. Augustine decisively rejected both the notion of a fully sacralized state and the withdrawal of Christians from society. Instead, he advocated what might be called a critical engagement, active participation that recognizes the inherent imperfection and ambiguity of all earthly politics, while keeping eyes fixed on the transcendent and eschatological hope. That's not an easy thing to do. Augustine's vision shaped medieval and Reformation models of church-state relations, serving both as justification for engagement and a critique of political idolatry. This remains at the heart of Western Christian political thought to this day. Indeed, it does. And we're off again. Stop 4. This time we land in Rome at the end of the 5th century. With the collapse of centralized Roman authority in the West, new barbarian kingdoms are popping up all over in its place. In response, the Western Church increasingly exercised influence, developing theological models such as Pope Gelasius I's doctrine of the two powers to justify and regulate the relationship between spiritual and temporal authority. So what was the two powers theory? Initially articulated by Pope Gelasius in his letter Duo Sunt in 494, the doctrine posited two divinely established authorities: the spiritual authority of the church, especially the papacy, and the temporal authority of kings and rulers. While each possessed legitimate power within its own sphere, soul and body, heaven and earth, Gelasius insisted that in ultimate matters, the priestly authority is greater, since it answers for kings before God and governs the fate of souls. This was an important innovation, the first systematic articulation of a distinct spiritual temporal power, and the first clear assertion that spiritual authority takes precedence over temporal authority. Over the centuries, Gelasius' doctrine of the two powers evolved into the medieval doctrine of two swords. That would be 4. Two swords. There you go. Based on the interpretation of Luke 22:38. Look, Lord, look, here are two swords. To which Jesus replied, "It is enough." Now, this passage has several possible meanings, but in the Middle Ages it was read as symbolizing the two authorities: the spiritual sword held by the Pope, and the temporal sword wielded by kings and magistrates. Some thinkers even argue that both swords ultimately derived from the papacy, with the temporal sword delegated to secular rulers. Do you see where this is going? Do you feel the tension a little bit? Having spent so many years reading books on Christian nationalism, I feel the tension, and I can see how this tension moved back and forth. But again, I digress. Let's keep on track here. We go to stop 5, which grows right out of the one we were just on. And I really get a kick out of this next story because few historical episodes so dramatically illustrate the struggle for supremacy between church and state as what is called the investiture controversy. I also get a kick out of it because you'll see it's kind of fun and silly in a weird sort of way. From 1076 until 1122, the papacy and Holy Roman Empires clashed over who had the authority to appoint, that is to say, invest bishops, abbots, and even the Pope. A conflict that struck at the heart of both ecclesiastical and secular power in Western Europe. And that issue was the established practice of lay investiture. Traditionally, so to speak, kings and nobles would appoint bishops, often from powerful families, and invested them with the symbols of office. For emperors like Henry IV, this was essential to maintaining control over his vast political empire, especially the wealthy church lands. For the papacy, especially under reforming popes like Gregory VII, there was a whole reform movement that takes it aside, but he was part of that. From him onwards, it represented an intolerable usurpation of spiritual authority and a corrupting influence, contributing to simony and the politicization of ecclesial offices. And I think you can see that. If I get to decide you're going to be a bishop, what's in it for us? That kind of thing. This is where the story gets really fun then, I think, for the next slide. Yes. The conflict reached dramatic heights when Pope Gregory VII excommunicated and deposed Emperor Henry IV, releasing Christians from their allegiance to the emperor. Now, think about that for a minute. Henry's act of penance at Canossa in 1077 is where he stood, and that's what this picture is showing, barefoot in the snow for 3 days to win absolution, which symbolized the temporary triumph on whose behalf? The Pope's. Yeah. However, real resolution required decades of further struggle, culminating in the Concordat of Worms in 1122, which clarified the roles. Secular rulers could grant temporal powers, but the spiritual investiture of bishops was reserved for the church. A compromise was made, but the damage, frankly, was final, and the church-state relationship began its process of coming apart. That takes us to our next stop, and the great Pope Boniface. One might say that Pope Boniface VIII threw fuel on the fire of papal rivalry when, in 1302, he issued his notorious bull Unum Sanctum, or One Holy Church. In it, he declared that both swords, the spiritual and the temporal, are in the power of the church. The spiritual wielded directly by the priesthood, the temporal wielded by kings and knights, but only at the bidding of the church. The bull insisted that the temporal must be subject to the spiritual. Far from resolving tensions, as you can imagine, between papal supremacy and royal autonomy, it blew it up. While the investiture controversy had already passed, Unum Sanctum became the definitive late medieval statement of what is called papal hierocracy, holy rule, and shaped later debates on sovereignty, legitimacy, and the basis of law. Its long-term impact was profound. The papacy advanced unprecedented claims to universal spiritual authority, while secular monarchies, especially in France and in England, began to chafe under that and started asserting greater independence in governing their churches and bureaucracies. So you can see how these things are starting to move apart. The medieval idea of Corpus Christianum, which is a Latin way of saying a unified Christian society where church and state were distinct but interdependent, remained, but the balance within it shifted, sowing seeds for the later rise of sovereign nation states and modern concepts of church-state separation. The long-term effects are with us to this day. And I put up a little summary here. They include kings and princes began to consolidate power within defined territories, laying the groundwork for what would later become the sovereign nation states. The idea that political authority could exist apart from ecclesiastical control gained traction. Later thinkers built on this to argue for a secular autonomy. The Reformation would later explode this tension as Protestant rulers rejected papal authority altogether. And eventually, Enlightenment thinkers and constitutional framers, like in the US, would formalize the separation of church and state as a principle of governance. Now, I stopped here with this quick summary of where we've been so far, so you can kind of see where the movement is going. That takes us to stop 7. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century did not merely continue the old tension between Pope and Prince, it blew it up. What emerged was nothing less than a seismic reordering of the relationship with church and state, shattering the medieval vision of Corpus Christianum and ushering in radical new models of religious authority, political power, and how the two related to each other. Excuse me, just a second. What began with theological protests, remember Martin Luther, against indulgences and clerical corruption and simony and papal overreach, etc., quickly spiraled into a social and political revolution. In some ways, if you study the history of Martin Luther and you'll find that at one point, Luther, I think, kind of thought things got out of control. Luther, who at first insisted he sought only to reform the church, in practice unleashed forces that destabilized both the spiritual and the temporal order. His doctrine of the priesthood of all believers, which if you are part of the clerical class, which made you a kind of a step above, that undercut that monopoly of clerical authority. While his appeals to German princes against Rome implicitly strengthened the hand of these secular rulers. The consequences were dramatic. Across the German lands and beyond, rulers seized the right to determine the fate of their territories. There's this principle, which actually comes a little later, but I'm introducing it here. Curius regio, well, never mind. Whose realm, his religion. I never took Latin. He appropriated vast church estates and assumed unprecedented control over the appointment of clergy and the regulation of doctrine. In other words, cutting the Pope out of the whole conversation. If I'm the prince, if I'm the magistrate, and I happen to be a Lutheran, we are a Lutheran land. Period. Okay. In the process, the Reformation not only fractured Western Christendom, but also laid the foundations for the modern nation state and the principle that political sovereignty could exist apart from papal supremacy. Now, most of us know the story about Henry VIII, how he broke with Rome over his matrimonial disputes, which I think is putting it kindly, leading to the Act of Supremacy in 1534, declaring the king as the supreme head of the church in England. What a reversal. This model of a national church subordinate to the crown became widely emulated across Protestant polities in Europe. And as a result, religious uniformity was enforced at the expense of both papal claims and religious pluralism. Persecution and coercion remained common, only with different ecclesiastical masters. In other words, what I'm saying is, it went from the Pope declaring what we are to the king declaring what we are, and you will be that. If I'm a Lutheran, you're a Lutheran. And if you try and act different than that, well, we know what happened to the Anabaptists, right? So you see the shift here? Not long ago, we saw the Pope claiming primacy over kings and emperors. Now that world has inverted. We have the birth of the state church, or as we came to know it, the established church, where the magistrate is over the church. And this will range from correct doctrine to moral practice and the authority to enforce both. The rise of state churches meant the transfer of ultimate authority from pope to prince. Instead of papal supremacy, the magisterial reformers, Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, advocated a shared or even state-dominated model, often leading to the suppression of radical or dissenting voices. Only later did the fragmentation and conflict generated by religious wars provoke calls for toleration and the separation of spheres culminating in the Peace of Westphalia. Well, let me just briefly explain that. There was all kinds of problems which culminated in this Peace of Westphalia, in which no longer were you required to be a Lutheran if you were in the Lutheran state. The state church would still be Lutheran, but if you wanted to be an Anabaptist, you could be that. And so at that point, what we have is also important because it became the birth of pluralism, and some would argue secularism. Now, before we move on to part two, which is where I'm going to begin to focus on America, let's do a quick summary of the key turning points that laid the groundwork for the American experience. So first, you have Constantine in the 4th century, creating a church-state alliance. The Christian emperor becomes supreme. You have the investiture controversy in the 11th and 12th centuries, and papal power becomes over the monarchs, papal supremacy. The Reformation in the 16th century, the state over the church, and a move towards early nationalism, political sovereignty. In the Peace of Westphalia, the birth of secularism, religious tolerance, and sovereignty. So that capitalizes where we are to this day, and prepares the way for us to move on then to part two, which is the place of Christianity in America. We shift our focus to the founding of America and the place and role Christianity played in it. Where we just landed is important because it paved the way for what occurred among the American colonies and later the founding of the American state. So we take ourselves to our 8th stop. Our journey now crosses the Atlantic to the rocky shores of New England, where the Puritans carried the Reformation struggle into a new world. Dissatisfied with the compromises of the English crown they felt on true Christianity, they sought to build a city on the hill, which is what Kirk was talking about this morning, although I think their idea is a little bit different than what he was saying. They sought to build a city on the hill, a society governed by biblical principles and church-centered norms. Their innovation was known as the New England Way, which fused congregationalist self-rule with state support. Magistrates were able to enforce moral discipline. Church membership opened the door to civic participation. In other words, if you weren't a member of the church, you couldn't participate in the civic side, public square. And the colony itself became a kind of covenant community, very much informed by its Reformed tradition behind it. Yet there was a lot of rhetoric of religious liberty, if you might remember these things. But the rhetoric of religious liberty masked a very narrow vision. Religious dissent was in fact not tolerated. Roger Williams and Anne Hutchison were cast out of Massachusetts for challenging the Puritan order. Their exile, however, gave birth to Rhode Island, a radical experiment in freedom of conscience and the separation of church and state. Wilson, ahead of his time, insisted that when the state coerces faith, it corrupts both church and soul. I want you to remember this idea. Let me say it again. He insisted that when the state coerces faith, it corrupts both church and soul. Now, in this clash between Puritan conformity and dissenting liberty, the seeds of America's future debates over religious freedom were first sown. Elsewhere in the colonies, there were more diverse religious arrangements. Virginia and the Carolinas established the Church of England. Maryland, initially a haven for Catholics, shifted to Protestant. In New York, there was a patchwork of tolerated Protestant faiths, though Catholicism was often excluded. In other words, the early colonies were a mixed bag of religious beliefs and practices. A mixed bag, and that you got to hold on to that because that's important. Now, over time, the American experience created fertile ground for ideas of religious pluralism, voluntary association, as in you attend or not the church of your choice, something that we take for granted, wasn't common until that era, and eventually constitutional disestablishment of the church. One of my favorite historians is a guy named John Fee. He teaches history at a Mennonite college back east somewhere. He notes that given the diversity of religious practices, this is the mixed bag part, Anglicans, Puritans, Quakers, Baptists, Catholics, and others, developing a single state church seemed impossible. And indeed, that reality assisted in the First Amendment separation of church and state. The government will not form a state church, nor will it hinder anyone practicing whatever religion they want. Frankly, it seems like a very practical solution to what could have been a real, serious hornet's nest. You're going to think about all those different colonies and all the different religious traditions that those colonies developed, and then now try and put them all together. Seemed like a pretty good way to get it out of a mess. Put more elegantly, Fee sees the founders as navigating a complex religious landscape with prudence and constitutional foresight. And we move on to our next stop, the Great Awakening of the 1730s to the 1760s, which you also recognize is the beginning of the Revolutionary period. It was a series of mass Protestant revivals that transformed the religious and political life of American colonists. You had revivalist preachers like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield who emphasized personal conversion. Now, we think of that as normative, but it wasn't. If you were in a Lutheran land, you were just Lutheran. You went to Lutheran church, you went up, you went to catechesis, so all of a sudden there's this idea of you choosing at this moment to be a Christian, what they referred to as the new birth, individual responsibility, and an emotional egalitarian religion unmediated by traditional authorities, such as the church. The movement fractured existing churches into what was called then the Old Lights, which were the traditionalists, and the New Lights, which were the revivalists, which became the old side and new side in the Presbyterian Church. In practice, the awakening elevated the concept of individual religious liberty, diminished the absolute power of established churches, and led to an explosion of new denominations and voluntary societies. As an aside, by the way, evangelicalism is a descendant of the New Light movement. But I want to go back and emphasize this explosion of new denominations and voluntary societies. This was new. It all of a sudden became an open marketplace where you could get up and preach and have a following. I'll come back to that in a minute. Socially and politically, the awakening seeded ideas of equality, participation, and freedom, principles that would become crucial to the American Revolution. The proliferation of churches created an early form of pluralistic, competitive, religious marketplace and established the voluntary principle. In other words, faith must be freely chosen, not coerced by church or government, as a foundation for later church-state separation. And this is a critical point. Before this, under all forms of Christendom, the state provided the church. In other words, going back to the old saying, whose realm, his religion, which was a part of, in theory, because which one was a part of in theory because one was a citizen of the state. The voluntary principle meant that one actively chose faith or not, regardless of what the state thought. Now, this is a little aside, but I think it's an important one. It's not a little ironic for me that conservative evangelicals today are the strongest drivers to break down the separation of church and state, since it was the freewheeling evangelicals who are mostly responsible for institutionalizing religious freedom. The Awakening's message of spiritual and social equality prepared much of the population for later demographic developments and the defense of liberty of conscience, which to this day is baked into the PCUSA Book of Order. God alone is Lord of the conscience, and hath left it free from the doctrines and commandments of men, which are in anything contrary to his word, or recite it in matters of faith or worship. It's right into our Constitution. But that was a new, innovative idea. Stop 10. My next point is greatly debated among the more extreme proponents of Christian nationalism in America. By the way, we're getting close to our current period. At issue is the question, was America founded as a Christian nation? Yes or no? I like John Fee's initial answer. It's complicated. By the late 18th century, American political thought was deeply shaped both by the legacy of Christian ideas, for example, conceptions of human nature, sin, justice, and by an establishment philosophy, reason, social contract, religious toleration. The U.S. founders represented a spectrum. Some were devout. Others were more influenced by deism or rationalist critique. Virtually all acknowledged a provident order, but also feared the dangers of clerical power. Key figures such as Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin championed religious liberty as a first freedom. The rejection of established religion in the new federal Constitution was not a rejection of Christianity per se, but a conviction that faith must be uncoerced, which we all today, again, take for granted. The First Amendment thus forbade Congress from making laws respecting an establishment of religion, a clear break from both old world establishments and colonial experiments in enforced uniformity. The states followed suit over time, gradually disestablishing religion and extending legal protection to all faiths and to none. The influence of biblical concepts, such as human fallenness and need for checks and balances, can in fact be detected in the government. Justifications for resistance to tyranny and for equality before the law also drew on scriptural and Protestant precedent. At the same time, the founders were wary of religious enthusiasm, as seen in the Great Awakening, and anxious to avoid theocratic danger. In other words, letting religion get too much into the center of government. Their solution, a civil order that respected religion, but insisted on non-establishment. That became a defining American innovation. That's an American innovation. You ought to hold on to that right now. I point this out specifically because debates over the influence of Christianity in Americans' formation often swing between two caricatures. You have the Christian nationalist rewrite of history that sidelines the Enlightenment and canonizes Jefferson as a pious evangelical. Now, if you've ever read anything about Jefferson, the one who took the Bible and excised all of the miracles, wouldn't fit in your classic pious evangelical category. But somehow he managed to twist him into that. And on the other side, you have the secularist erasure that denies Christianity any formative role. I mean, the colonies were founded by a people coming from Western Europe out of a Christian civilization, whether it had been Protestant or Catholic or what it had been. It was a dominant motif in which they lived and breathed. So of course it had influence over what they founded. They blended Christian moral inheritance with Enlightenment political theory, and they intentionally barred national establishment of religion. That tension, reason, revelation, church and state, it wasn't a mistake. It was a design. And that brings us up to the present, at least the mid-20th century, and the rise of the religious right, or as I put on my note here, taking America back for God. That design was understood as constitutional for this country. It actually is constitutional, separation of church and state. Or is it? And with this question, we enter the modern current debate. Before we explore this, let me set the stage. Well, technically, the church and state were separated in American history, and we're now talking about the 1950s. There was still a cultural dominance of white Protestant denominational traditions, especially so in the South. As the 1960s came and went, and some of us will remember that era, not all, as the 60s came and went, conservative evangelicals could see the beginning of the decline of their social and moral influence over American culture. A decline that continued for the rest of the 20th century, and frankly continues to this day. You can see that in the demographics, where they're constantly tracking the growing number of nuns. Have you heard of that? No religious preference. I think when I first started doing that research back in early 1990s, it was like 11%. It's now like 35%, something like that. So definitely a decline in religious involvement. These evangelicals saw a decline in morality, a diminishment of white national identity, and a loss of traditional American culture, at least traditional as they understood it and defined it. And the reaction was immediate. The late 70s and 80s witnessed the rise of the religious right. And some of us remember this. A loose but powerful network of conservative Protestant, and in some cases Catholic, groups, leaders, and organizations mobilized around issues like prayer in schools, abortion, opposition to gay rights, and the defense of family values. The movement rallied millions of voters and reshaped the American political landscape. And I found this great quote by Senator Barry Goldwater in reaction to what he saw emerging in that period. Now, you may or may not know who Barry Goldwater is, but Barry Goldwater was very conservative, but he was a classic conservative, as opposed to the kind of conservative we think of today. And he says this: "Mark my word, if and when these preachers get control of the Republican Party, and they're sure trying to do so, it's going to be a terrible damn problem. Frankly, these people," he sounded like that too, by the way. "Frankly, these people frighten me. Politics and governing demand compromise, but these Christians believe they are acting in the name of God, so they can't and won't compromise. I know. I've tried to deal with them." Partisan politics, especially the Republican Party, were also reshaped. The movement was characterized by a strong defense of cultural conservatism, an opposition to secularism, and a rejection of pluralism, and a call for returning America to its Christian roots, because, after all, it is a Christian nation. The issues of racial desegregation, which, by the way, was the primary driver in the Protestant side actually getting involved in politics. It wasn't abortion. We had in the 60s, all the, what were called desegregation academies, or segregation academies. When the courts desegregated, then the conservative Christians, especially across the South, set up all these little school academies, where they didn't have to go along with it. And then what was happening is they began to be threatened with losing their 501c3 status. Now, another aside, my first teaching job in 1975, I think it was, fall, as a third grade school teacher. The only place I could get a job was in a Christian school. Turns out, when I look back, it was a segregation academy. But I only lasted a year because I kept getting in trouble because my hair kept touching the collar of my shirt. So anyway, the issues of racial desegregation, education, and abortion sparked initial activism, though over time the narrative was increasingly focused on broad Christian critique of a nation that had turned its back on God. This brings us to today. Contemporary Christian nationalism, as distinct from classical cultural conservatism, that's important. I wish I had time to explain all that, but I will a little bit next week, has embraced a vision of the United States not only as influenced by Christian values, but as a Christian nation that must return legal, cultural, and institutional priority to Christianity over other faiths or secularism. If it feels like we are coming full circle, it's because we are. In other words, this is my argument for ultimately their means to the end of dominion is a restored version of Christendom. Looking critically at what contemporary Christian nationalists are calling for looks very much like the state church model that the founders of America rejected. Each strand, the three, the Reformed, the New Apostolic Reformation, and the Catholic Integralists, each strand, which we'll explore next week, particularizes their model, but they all, of restored Christendom differently, but what they all have in common is a political reality wherein the church, or at least some version of it, is once again intimately connected with the state, where the church once again sets the moral standards for the body politic, and the magistrate's role is to enforce those standards. And as I said last week, Christendom is the means to doing that. The end is dominion. Why dominion? Because then they can impose their version of kingdom on earth. But I don't think that's exactly what Jesus meant when he said, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done." Now, hopefully this whirlwind tour of 2,000 years gives you more than a tired bottom, gives you at least a general understanding of how we've traveled from Jesus to Christian nationalism today. While some of the language I've used is contemporary, conceptually, we are looking at a movement that would roll back the clock 500 years, or in the case of Catholic integralists, 1,000 years. Next week, we shall go a little deeper into the current expressions of Christian nationalism by looking at the ethno-nationalist Reformed group, the New Apostolic Reformation, and the Catholic integralists. I think there's going to be some real surprises in store there, and maybe even a fair measure of incredulity. But with that, I'm done for today. I'll turn it over to some questions. I'll take questions now, and I think they have microphones. I don't even know what time it is. Have I blown past my time? Oh, I'm okay. Hi, you have a question for me? She just wanted to see me close up. Yeah, there he is. And it didn't even scare you. That's good. Did you hear what she said?
No, I didn't.
Take that into account before you say anything. She said, "You're amazing." Oh, a man. Oh. Well, amazing, a man. Sounds close. I'll take it.
So my question, and this may be way too far outside the realm, but I know many in the Christian nationalist movement regard themselves as Reformed,
Yes.
as being derived from the theology of John Calvin, and we Presbyterians are Reformed.
That's
and-
our family.
Right.
Yeah.
So there are many in the Christian nationalist movement who regard themselves as Presbyterian. So I mean, this is we're close cousins.
Yes.
In the period of the Reformation, in the 16th century, Calvin attempted a quasi-theocracy in Geneva.
Right.
And I was wondering, and then he got kicked out of Geneva by the Genevans who thought he'd gone too far, and then he got invited back. So there were actually two experiments in. To what degree do you think the Geneva experiments influenced the reform? I still struggle, I mean, Mike knows this, to see how much of this thinking can qualify itself as reformed, because it seems so not in keeping with so much of reformed theology. And yet, Calvin is used as justification for a great many of these ideas. Now, I think that's quite a warping of Calvin, but am I giving Calvin too much credit? Was his experience in Geneva an attempt at something that parallels Christian nationalism today?
Well, first of all, I have to say that I'm not an expert on Calvin. So obviously I'm in the Reformed family. I had to read a bit of Calvin in seminary and following in the strand that is the Reformed strand that like runs through Scotland and John Knox and the Puritans. They were very much in the Reformed. So I've kind of followed that because I have to, because over here I end up being me, right, and you. So we are in the same family. There is, in fact, a large contingent out there that is considers itself Reformed and consider themselves Presbyterian. But for the most part, in fact, I don't know of any that would consider themselves PCUSA Presbyterians. We will look next week for a few minutes, because I'm going to look at each strand just a little bit so you understand that there is, under the surface of what we talk about as Christian nationalism, there's a great deal of diversity. One strand is the Reformed, and that's the one that we're going to know the most about because it's our family. But the New Apostolic Reformation is very charismatic, and that's where most of the megachurches fall, and then the Catholic side. The Presbyterians that are part of this Reform thing tend to be PCA, Presbyterian Church in America, which is a very conservative form of Presbyterianism. I think the only confession they hold is the Westminster Confession. I don't think they hold, we have a book of confessions like this. Theirs is thin, which has some advantages, by the way. But anyway, they, in my estimation, are kind of stuck in the 17th century. They're more influenced by the Scottish scholastics, like Francis Turretin. I'll talk a little bit about that next week, than Calvin. It's just that Calvin is the one what grew out of Calvin is the strand that they are a part of. I hope that's semi-clear, because I'm not an expert on Calvin. But I do think what I have read, and I have read about Calvin and Calvin's Geneva, is that there is a correlation there. There is a correlation of what they're looking for. You have this kind of marriage between the magistrate and the church, with the church basically establishing this is the way we're supposed to live in this city. And the magistrate is responsible to make sure you do it. Okay? So I'm going to preach at you on Sunday morning, but if you go out in the streets and go against what I've preached on, he's going to pick you up. Okay? That's kind of being simplistic, but that's the idea. Well, that strand is the state church model that I'm saying is coming through today. And so when you look at the Reformed group, the ethnocentric Reformed, that is kind of their model. Okay? But we'll see more of that next week. Did I get to your question? It seemed like I talked a lot. Oh, I'm so sorry, everybody. Oh, I leaned exactly the wrong way, right into the microphone.
We're glad you're feeling better. I'm just curious that this Christian nationalism movement, it seems like it's got a big voice right now, particularly, in what we see. Just looking out into the future, the younger demographic, it seems like that would be trending more away from Christian nationalism. But
Actually, there's a whole segment of the younger Generation Z, I just was reading about this week, that is very much attracted to the more conservative side. The followers of some guy named Joe Rogan and others. I don't know who he is, but he keeps being mentioned. So I think I'm about 50 years too old for him. And the other thing that demographically that they're noticing is that you have more young men starting to attend church than women, but they're in these conservative churches where the conservative mantra is interwoven with all this Christian language and stuff. Did I get to your question? There was another part that I wanted to say, but I forgot. It's an aging brain. Anyone else?
I'll take a stab at this. So the question is, as you've shown over this 2,000-year history, this is the idea, now we've moved to this, now we've moved to this, now we seem to be circling back. Is this just probably where we're going to continue, is in this circle?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? And I read different things that suggest different things. One of the things that has been raised by people who are studying these things is whether these three different strands, these three different strands that I keep talking about, they are not going to be able to coexist for very long. At some point, their collective battle, and I'll talk about this next week, their collective battle is against what we would maybe refer to as classic liberalism. By liberalism, I don't mean liberals, I mean classic liberalism coming out of the Enlightenment, from which we get secularism, pluralism, things like that. That's their enemy. Once they defeat that enemy, then they're going to become enemies of each other. Because the Catholic integralists ultimately want to reinstate a world where the Pope is in the Pope Boniface position. That's not going to go down well with the Reformed group, okay? Because they already went around that once. It's called the Reformation. The New Apostolic Reformation, which sounds like Reformation, but it's not, is a whole. I was going to say next week, they win the award for being the kookiest, but it's a serious thing to consider. Just a lot of the big mega churches today are charismatic, are deeply embedded in this. So one of them is going to have to win, and the one that's got the most power behind it right now is the New Apostolic Reformation. And the others can't, because they each have a little. Christendom is the means, but I'm speaking generically at this point until we get particular. And their understanding of Christendom is not going to go well with the integralists or with the Reformed. So yes, there would be something worked out, and some have said by 2030, 2040, you're going to start seeing that all happening. I don't think I'm going to be here then, so we'll see. Wait for next week, too. I think I'm trying to not get into my lecture for next week, which I haven't written yet. Anybody else? Well, I hope that this little tour has been endurable. I really wrestled with doing it this way, but I kept coming back to, if my goal is to equip you with the mental tools to see and understand and know a response to it, then you need to get under the hood, as I said, and you got to see how things work and what powers what and what feeds what, so that you can see it. Because when you just listen to all the blather up here, mostly what it can do is just make you mad. That doesn't help. I know there was one last thing I wanted to say too, and then we're going to be done. When we start looking out then at what's going on in the public right now in this country, and you can pick certain leaders that are out there. And so let's take, for example, Mike Johnson, who I fully believe is a genuinely sincere Christian man. But he is a part of the NAR movement. And to be a part of the NAR movement means to look for developing a certain form of dominion. Or you look at Pete Hegseth. That was one of the other reforms I wanted to talk about. There's this Doug Wilson, I think I mentioned last time, who made this weird statement about women are the kind of people that people come out of. It's a very evangelical reformed group that he's formed, and Hegseth is part of that. So he's part of the reformed, ethno-nationalist reformed. And there was somebody else that I was going to point out, and I've lost it. But so I want us to be able to start connecting those dots. So when you hear somebody talk, you go, okay. I tried to figure out a way to put Marjorie Taylor Greene in a box. Doesn't work. So I gave up. Same with Lauren Boebert. I mean, I just think sometimes things come out of their mouths. But you know, there is a thoughtfulness to Hegseth, and there is a thoughtfulness to Mike Johnson in what they're associated with. And I want you to be able to understand that thoughtfulness. All right, with that, I'll see you next week. Thank you for being here. And again, thank you for enduring me not being consistent and being here last week.